And tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the iconic album Janet, right?
Mm.
So I just want to take a moment to talk about this because while I love to do deep history and all that good stuff, this is a part of Black history because
Mm-hmm.
the Janet album was such an important album for the music industry, for quote unquote pop music, for women in music, and for Black women in music. So just a few things that I want to break down when you think about the Janet album. The album comes out May 18th, 1993. It has the songs If, That's the Way Love Goes,
Mm-hmm.
and You Want This, the whole bit. But I want to go back to 1991. Janet Jackson, and this is also the days where folks will release an album once every 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
This is, Beyonce does that now. She'll wait. But, back then, everybody, nowadays, everybody got a new album out every other year. But Janet would wait like 4 years in between albums because her albums would have a shelf life for a very long time.
Right.
In 1991, Janet Jackson makes history when she leaves A&M Records and she signs a deal with Virgin for $40 million.
Holy moly.
This was unheard of at the time. Black, white, man, woman. No one had ever signed this kind of record deal before. And the New York Times wrote this quote, that's more than the Rolling Stones, Bruce Springsteen, or Miss Jackson's brother Michael are guaranteed by their contracts. So Janet has a huge hit with Control, another huge hit with Rhythm Nation, and then in 91 she signs this deal, and then in 93 the Janet album comes out.
Mm.
So the stakes were high. The
Yeah.
stakes were high. Can she do this again? Is she just, is it because of her brother? Is it because of Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis? The stakes are high. So a couple other things to acknowledge as well, too, that we're talking about 92, 93. This is a very conservative time. This is a very anti-sexual time.
Mm-hmm.
The HIV AIDS epidemic is ravaging the country. Bush just gets out of office, thank God. But we now have Clinton in office. But Clinton, in many ways, was conservative too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for women in music, it was very tough. And although they're different artists, it's important to note the year before, Madonna had an album that came out called Erotica, and it was very sexual. It was in 92, and she was vilified for it.
Mm-hmm.
Vilified, she was tore apart for it. And it's important that even when we think about women artists being sexual, we got to also acknowledge Grace Jones, right? Grace Jones, in many ways, paved the way for everybody, right? The way she was provocative. But I think it's fair to say Grace was more of like a performance artist in a way, and
Yeah.
like a big pop star. That's fair, right? She was
Mm-hmm.
more, performance art. So Janet Jackson releases the Janet album. Originally, the label didn't want the song "That's the Way Love Goes" to be the first single. They wanted a big dance track because
Yeah.
they wanted to be seen as a dance artist. As the
Mm-hmm.
story goes, she's in the studio with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and Chuck D is there. And the label wants If to be released, but Janet wants That's the Way Love Goes. So they ask Chuck D, they say, what do you think? The label's pushing back on us. What do you think? And Chuck D hears That's the Way Love Goes, and he goes, If is a good song, but that song, That's the Way Love Goes, that's some Sade shit.
Mm.
And Janet's convinced. Janet's like, F it. We're going to make this happen. And she was right. The single is number one for 8 weeks in the Billboard Hot 100. Now, this is also the era when you would release your first single and the album wouldn't come out until like a month and a half, 2 months later, right? So
Yeah.
That's the Way Love Goes is booming on the charts, and the Janet album is released. And this causes an international controversy. I know it might surprise some people today, but for Janet Jackson as a black woman to be this sexual on an album, conservatives and even some black conservatives. They were outraged.
Mm.
She got so much backlash. There was comments of how could she go from Let's Wait a While to a song like Throb or to a song like Anytime, Any Place. She was there was really a lot of heat around her. And then of course there is that famous Rolling Stone cover where she's
Mm.
topless on the cover and her then husband is holding her breasts. And there was a lot of just backlash to her because in my opinion, we really had never seen a black woman artist embrace sexuality in this way.
Mhm.
Again, you do have, like I said, Grace Jones. You have Eartha Kitt as well, but Eartha Kitt is an actress. But the way that Janet did it, having that intersection of being a woman and being black, it was just unheard of. Then on top of that, on the Janet album, she combines elements of hip hop. Now again, folks might think, so what? Like that isn't a big deal. Back then, that was a big deal because hip hop was being vilified by a lot of conservatives and some folks in our own community. Some folks said that it was too gangster. Then it was also being accused of being too radical
Mm.
with groups like Public Enemy. So it was getting it from both sides. And in Janet's interviews during the Janet era, you see her defending hip hop, saying that she's learned more about her history from hip hop than she did in school. And she had Chuck D on a song called New Agenda. And she talks about one of the lines is, proud African American woman. Now, in the Rhythm Nation era, folks felt like Janet was, being a little bit more colorblind and, we are a
Mhm.
nation with no geographic boundaries. And of course, embracing her blackness, but she letting you know, right, proud African American woman and Chuck D's on the track.
Mm.
And this was very rare for mainstream artists to have hip hop artists on their albums. Now everybody does it. But you got to give credit to Janet. She was one of the first artists to do that. Then she releases the single "You Want This" and puts MC Light on a version for the video. Again, I mean, now we got a female MC a part of this project. That wasn't anything that you would ever seen before from mainstream artists. So the ways in which that she's breaking down barriers, uh, unapologetic, unbossed,
Mm.
one of the biggest record contracts in history, and getting all this heat, all this attack from conservative people saying you went too far, you shouldn't be this sexual. And what they're really saying is that a black woman shouldn't be this sexual. A black
Mm.
woman should not go this far. You were a goody two shoes, whatever the case may be. And so the album is just a seminal moment in pop culture history, in music history, and in black history. And I'm not going to name any names, but a lot of folks copy this formula
Mm.
after Janet. And that Rolling Stone cover, the cover said Janet Jackson, The Joy of Sex. Oh Lord, how people could have taken
Mm.
it. Before viral photos. This is before
Yeah.
Instagram. This is before any of that. The fact that she was able to make a magazine cover, a international conversation, was just incredible. She writes 90% of the record. Of course, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis producing. Pretty much all of the writing is hers. And Janet really showed that although Rhythm Nation is brilliant, Control is brilliant, this
Mhm.
is her stepping into her womanhood and fully owning herself as an artist. And then with that business deal of getting $40 million, it paved the way for Mariah Carey. Later on, I think we'll get $80 million from Virgin Records. And then Janet would send Mariah a bouquet of flowers in a celebration. So I just want to take a moment, 30 years ago, coming on tomorrow, we think about the stuff that Michael's done and Prince has done and Madonna's done, da da da. This was, I remember it. I bought my mom got me the cassette
Mhm.
the day it came out, and I remember how big of a deal this album was. And albums aren't that big of a deal anymore. And even when you think of the visuals, nowadays artists do these visual albums. baby, the visuals for Janet, the Janet album, If, Anytime, Any Place, You Want This. Again, of course, then we have the film Poetic Justice. She gets an Oscar nomination
Mm.
for the song again. I mean, it was just the era of Janet. Again, a movie, an album, the discussion around the cover, and it was all Janet Jackson. So on this day, I just want to take a moment to honor Miss Janet 30 years later, and her legacy just cannot be forgotten. Nobody did it like this before. And although, Janet, she may have had some help with being a Jackson, but her talent is undeniable. You can't
Mhm.
sustain this way and not have the talent. You know what I mean? So, on this moment, a little bit of Black history, I have to call out the legendary Janet Jackson. And so this moment was really big for me as a young kid, and I'm assuming for so many other people. 30 years ago, she blew up the music industry. So there we go.
I
Y'all
know
want to
that's
add to
right.
that, Miss Janet? And she's a Taurus too. And she's a Taurus. Go ahead, Reese.
I mean, she's everything. She's a living legend. She's iconic. And I'm so glad you pointed out how she writes her music. For some reason, it didn't dawn on me that Janet and even Mary J. Blige, that they write their own music because they're not talked about as being songwriters. They're talked about as being these legends. And so it's so important to talk about how far we've come. Like now we got the City Girls, we got Megan Thee Stallion, we got Lotto and Nicki Minaj and Cardi B and all of them. And it's like, people really like Nicki Minaj, for instance, she gets people such a hard time about not paying homage to her, but it's like there would be no Nicki Minaj if it wasn't for a Janet Jackson, so, and she paved the way for Lil Kim and Foxy Brown and all these women to really come out and be sexually liberated. But I also think about like a Chloe Bailey right now, who is coming into her womanhood, coming from the kind of wholesome, sister group. And Janet is like an inspiration for that. So I think we do have to continue to kind of go back to 30 years ago is a long time, but it's not a long time, and see how different things were and really like recognize the queen being a queen. So Janet, she did that. And happy birthday, Janet Jackson, again.
Amisha, I know you were a child when the Janet album came out. I know you were very young.
Love the
But just
music,
your
but was
thoughts.
definitely love the music, but was definitely a toddler. My mom was a really big Janet Jackson fan. Growing up, to be honest, I thought we were related to Janet because her pictures were all in the house right next to all of our family photos. Come to find out, we were not at all. My family was just groupies. Where Michael Jackson is the king of pop, Janet Jackson is the queen. This was a monarchy of pop family. And I think that to your point earlier, and to something Reese said, I went to a music school. I majored in political science and journalism, but I graduated from Belmont University, one of the largest music schools in the country. When you talk about songwriting, a lot of Black artists don't get the credit, specifically those within the pop industry, because other people write for them. So when we're talking about Michael, when we're talking about Janet, we're talking about artists who were able to peel back that layer and put their own words to print and perform. And because she is a Black woman, because she's a Black woman who comes on the heels of a lot of being at the intersection of not only her gender, but also race, she was always going to have a harder time in a sexual revolution of sorts, because we all know that for Black women to appear feminine, for Black women to appear sexual, that is something that is oftentimes demonstratively satanic in many ways. America has thrown so much shade on it and has made Black women seem to be this extra promiscuous culture, this extra promiscuous group. So for her to be able to do that and not be shunned by not only our people. Yes, there were negative articles that came out. Yes, there were some negative commentaries, and there were even elected officials who were like, oh my gosh, it's going to change how people raise their kids. That always
Yeah.
happens. We've seen it with Nicki
Always.
Minaj. We've seen it with Megan Thee Stallion. We see it in different iterations year after year. I think that because she had amassed the audience that she had, because her music was so captivating, because her talent was beyond measure, she was able to continue to assail despite all of the attacks that she was receiving. And she was willing to do it, because we have to remember, this was Penny. This was the young girl who grew up, who's on a popular sitcom. This was the girl whose father didn't really appreciate and didn't want her to come into her sexuality. This is the woman who often battled with her own body image. Janet has been very open about that, how she felt about her weight, how she felt about having to basically tape her boobs when she was on the show. She's very open about the struggles that she had stepping into her womanhood and trying to understand what that actually meant, and knowing that being a Black woman is a political statement, whether you want it to be or not. So I give a large amount of respect to Janet because she opened those doors, she allowed for others to walk through, and she wasn't just endemic on Black culture. You cannot talk to white pop queens who don't give their homage to Janet Jackson.
Oh,
Britney
yes.
Spears would not be here. Christina Aguilera would not be here.
Right.
We name after name, everyone knows what Janet's revelations were to the culture, but also to the music industry as a whole.